Welcome back to the Vandy Sports Podcast brought to you by Butler Holdings. I'm here with Brandon Bigsby. My name's Elena Morris, and we've got a lot to talk about today with Vanderbilt women's basketball. They just wrapped up the non-conference portion of their season and finished with a record of 13-1. So a very good start for Shea Ralph and her squad. Brandon, just initial thoughts maybe on how the non-conference season went, especially we'll talk about that one loss against Michigan State.
Yeah, really just impressive for Shea Ralph and her whole team. Obviously the 13-1 record, super, super impressive. But I think the number one thing, Elena, that really sticks out to you, and obviously they had the one loss against Michigan State that we'll touch on a bit, but just how dominant Vanderbilt was really in 13 of those 14 games they played. They're top five in the country right now in point differential with a plus 33. Maybe not the highest end of competition in all of those games, but still were able to kind of test themselves against some pretty solid squads. They played against the South Florida squad in Tampa early in the year, a game that I know you and I both thought before the season would be a pretty challenging test against a mid-major, quote unquote, that's been one of the more consistent in the country the last few years. Dominant game against Butler, who hasn't been too bad, beat Arizona rather soundly. Miami was a really big game for them to go on the road against a team that, by the way, is currently 11-2 and is in the bubble conversation. Go over to Coral Gables and beat them convincingly by 18. Really, the only game that I'd say that wasn't convincing that they won was probably Dayton, and that was still a 14-point win for them. So, really, not just that they won 13 out of their 14 games, but just the dominance that they did it with. The one game that did kind of plague them, however, was that Michigan State game. And I think that's a game that Shea Ralph has been very vocal about, that they want to have back. She feels like Michigan State didn't necessarily beat them, but Vanderbilt beat themselves. And it was really that fourth quarter to cost them. They got outscored 33-21 in that fourth quarter. Grace Van Sluden and Julia Ayral really just kind of took over the game in that fourth quarter for the most part. It just felt like Vanderbilt kind of ran out of energy in that last 10 minutes of that game. And honestly, I know we'll talk about this a little bit. I think if Vanderbilt wins that game, they're probably top 15 in the country right now, rather than looking just on the outside looking in. But nevertheless, you could maybe argue that that game was a blessing in disguise for them to get that out of the way now, kind of see that, you got to play a full four quarters against a team like that matches up well with you, especially a very physical Michigan State team. I think that's a loss that will prepare them arguably better for SEC play than any of their wins did. So unfortunate for the Commodores that they didn't get the perfect 14-0 record, but personally, I think that loss prepares them well for what they're going to see in SEC play. So overall, amazing non-conference slate for Shea Ralph and her team. I think they should be really, really happy about what they saw. And I think we've learned a lot about this team over the last 2 months as well.
I agree too. It's the fashion that they were able to win those games in. I mean, you mentioned they only lost Michigan State, and right after they played Miami, and I'll rephrase a little bit how Shea Ralph said it, but in nice words, sometimes you just have to get beat to learn your lesson. Is essentially what she said. And I think they learned that lesson. They went down to Miami and absolutely dominated an ACC team that's considered an NCAA tournament team at the moment. And if that's your only loss to a team who's number 19 in the country right now, your only loss is a quad one loss, you can't really hang your hat that much, that's tough. But it's a good lesson. It taught you things. And I think that, they learned from that. And so, I mean, right after, like I said, they played Miami, and she said that that was one of the most complete games that she had seen from her team to that point. So I do think that it's a lesson to learn, losing maybe a game or two in the non-conference in which they did to a good team. That is very big and very physical. And so maybe, it's a loss at the beginning of the year that those lessons might make up for it in an SEC game. But you're right, they did beat those teams. Maybe the lower Division 1 or mid-major, yes, they should beat them, but it's the way that they beat them. They were beating teams by 40, 50 points. They scored over 100 points 4 different times. I mean, it's a very impressive thing to do. And so I think that it's the fashion that they're playing, their defense too. I think that's something that's really been pushed and emphasized by Shea Ralph is that they want to be able to be very physical on nights that their offense isn't great. And I believe in every game they're forced every team to make 20 or more turnovers. So, I mean, just that alone right there speaks to the physicality that they play with. But I mean, just as an example, going into SEC play on Thursday, so we've got a couple of days until we're there. They played Georgia. Vanderbilt hosted Hampton and beat Hampton by 50. Hampton went down to Georgia and beat them on a buzzer beater. And I think that just speaks to, not Georgia, and it's not a rip on Georgia, but it's how Vanderbilt is controlling those games. It shouldn't be, a knock on the lower teams. It should be, wow, Vanderbilt is playing that well that they're capable of winning those games by that large of a margin.
Yeah, and we'll talk about Georgia a little bit, obviously, but the thing too that I feel like people often can forget sometimes when they look at these games in the non-conference schedule, they'll kind of look at them like, oh, they're bye games. You should beat Evansville by 40. You should beat West Virginia by 45 or 50. And you might have a point in that, but at the same time, you still have to go out there and do it. We've seen plenty of times in college basketball, both on the men's and women's side, where a team can come in and really shock you. I mean, we just saw it a couple of days ago, Atlanta. Norfolk State went into Auburn and beat them. Nobody would have thought that would have happened at the beginning of the season, especially for an Auburn team that you have to remember was kind of in the conversation of, well, are they going to maybe make the tournament last year? So you never know what's going to happen on a game to game basis. Talent can take you only so far, and you still have to go out there and execute. And Vanderbilt, for pretty much all of their games outside of maybe 2 quarters, have executed really, really, really well. And you mentioned too the stat about the 4 games they've scored 100 plus points. That arguably could be a lot higher. They scored 93 against Austin P. They scored, I'm looking at it now, 88 against Miami, 94 against App State. They scored 93 against Alabama A&M on Sunday. And this is a team that hasn't shot the three ball necessarily well. They're at 31%, which is a little bit lower than what they shot at last season. So you could argue maybe if a few more shots fall, they could be at 6 or 7 games with 100 plus points scored. So this is a Vanderbilt team that, as you mentioned, not only were they winning games and they were taking care of business, but they were doing it in arguably the most dominant fashion that I think you really could have asked of them. So really, really impressive stuff. And I know you talked about the SEC play. I'm really interested to see how this carries over now, especially with those first 2 games being at home and with a lot potentially being on the line for Vanderbilt as well.
Yeah, for sure. We can kind of segue into the SEC because I think you touched on it very well, especially, I mean, the non-conference play. The only win, I guess, that wasn't quote unquote convincing was Dayton, and they won by double digits, I believe 17, like you said. And talking to Shay Ralph after that game, I was at Dayton. She said, I don't really, like when wins feel like losses, but that one kind of did. And I think that also speaks to the way she coaches her team and her mindset and the mentality that she wants them to have is like, yeah, you might have won the game, but that was not our best game. And so I think she recognizes that too. She's not just like, oh, we won, that's great. Let's keep winning. It's we might have won, but that wasn't a great game, so let's learn from it. And I think that's why they were so successful in the non-conference. And they're going to have to carry that over to SEC play. This week's a really big week for Vanderbilt. And like we saw earlier this week, the AP top 25 left them just outside once again. They received 26 votes, putting them at 26, technically, if you were to rank them. And so, they're just right on the fringe. If they would have beat Michigan State, like we said, they'd have a number next to their name. But that's in the past. You can't go back and change that. But instead, look at the next 2 games. You have Georgia at home on Thursday. I think that's a great SEC opener. You're at home against a team that you should feel comfortable enough or confident going into that game that they have the ability to beat them and be comfortable. You're not opening up at a powerhouse like South Carolina where it might be a little bit tougher, especially when you're trying to get ranked. But Georgia, I think, is a great opportunity. ESPN is giving Vanderbilt a 98% chance to win that game, so they're pretty confident in the Commodores too. And I don't want to look past that game because obviously when you get to SEC play, anything goes. The record is now 0-0. I mean, you never know what's going to happen. But Sunday's game against Kentucky is going to be a very big game for Vanderbilt. And I think that if they get past Georgia like they should, a win on Sunday will allow Vanderbilt to crack those rankings, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think if Vanderbilt can find a way to be 2-0 this time next week, they have a number next to their name, and I don't think there should be any doubt about it. And the one game that I think that Vanderbilt fans should be watching very, very closely outside of obviously the Commodores is Michigan versus UCLA this week. Michigan is currently ranked 24th. UCLA is one of the top 5 teams in the country. You probably would assume, obviously, anything can happen, but you have to assume that UCLA, if they win that game and do it rather convincingly, that game is tomorrow on New Year's Day, 4 p.m. Central Time. UCLA being the number 1 team in the country, if Michigan loses that game with them being so low, have to assume that Vanderbilt probably surpasses them if they go 2-0. So the path is right in front of Vanderbilt. And you mentioned it. You don't want to overlook Georgia. That obviously is still an SEC game. That is a team that is going to be looking to kind of get right after they struggled in November, had the loss to Hampton, played Virginia Tech pretty close and lost to them, lost to Colorado State by 16 just a couple of nights ago. They're going to want to try to come in and have that opportunity. And Elena, we saw it last year. Vanderbilt come in, kind of look a little bit too far ahead of the schedule and lose a home game they shouldn't have lost last year against Missouri in a very similar situation. So that is not a game you want to overlook, but assuming that Vanderbilt does take care of business and win that game, Kentucky, that's the big one. And I got to be honest, I can't remember a bigger game that Vanderbilt has had in the last 10 years as a program than what that Kentucky game could potentially end up being. The last time Vanderbilt was ranked was February of 2014. That is 10 years ago, almost 11. So a massive, massive opportunity for the Commodores to not just get themselves ranked, but I also think make a statement. I think a lot of people feel like Vanderbilt should be ranked already, but maybe there's just kind of some of that issue to where maybe it's name recognition, maybe it's because they haven't necessarily gone on to prove that they can beat teams that are in that top 25 tier. Michigan State, their lone loss, got into the top 25 after beating Vanderbilt and have stayed there soundly since. I think that this is an opportunity for Vanderbilt to make a statement, not just to get themselves ranked, but just to show we are in that level of teams as a program. So that game's going to be really, really interesting. And I think you can make the argument that it's definitely the biggest home game that Vanderbilt has had, not just in the Shea Ralph era, but arguably in the last decade.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, home game, and as far as like, describing it as a big game, yes, there have been big teams come to town. Kim Mulkey and LSU came to town last year. Yeah, that's a big team. But I think that when we're talking about big game, to be clear, this is an important game. This is
Yeah.
number 16 Kentucky. They have Georgia Amore, who is an incredible point guard, and their style of play is very interesting to me. And it's going to be I'm very curious to see which one is going to overpower the other on Sunday because Kentucky is long. Besides Deja Lawrence and Georgia Amore, they're pretty tall and they're pretty lengthy. But Vanderbilt, maybe a little bit of a smaller team, incredibly physical. I would not categorize Kentucky as an incredibly physical team. They kind of dominate with their height. So I'm curious to see which one kind of takes over there. And another factor too for this game, I think the crowd is going to be important, honestly. I mean, marketing for Vanderbilt has deemed this one the dollar ticket day. And so I don't know if you remember this one last year, Brandon, but they did that one against Florida. And that was one of the most highest attended home games outside of Tennessee and LSU last year at home. And so Kentucky, not too far from Nashville. I'm very curious to see how many people are going to show up to Memorial on Sunday. How many people are going to be wearing blue, how many people are wearing black and gold. I think it's going to be honestly a big part of the game too is the crowd.
Yeah, I think the crowd will have a really big part in that game. And it's going to be interesting because, like you said, Kentucky, they are a fan base that is known to travel. They're known to travel well. And remember, this is a Kentucky team that had their struggles a season ago, and they're now finally into that ranked area again. So it's going to be interesting. By the way, I just looked up the number for the official attendance for that Florida game last year. 4,737. So a pretty solid crowd for a game that was on a Sunday at 1 p.m. as well. So, this is going to be interesting. I think that this probably would surpass that, especially considering that Kentucky is a much better opponent than what Florida was, a Florida team that finished bottom five in the SEC last year. Vanderbilt, I think, is a much better team than what they were a year ago, not just in terms of talent on the roster, but just in the production, the way they're playing. This is going to be really, really interesting. I mean, you mentioned Kentucky and just how they match up with them. I think Vanderbilt definitely can beat Kentucky if they are firing on all cylinders. And you mentioned something that I think will be a big factor too, is the physicality. Kentucky is a long team, as you mentioned, but they are not a team that is very physical. And I think that you can look at a game where they played a team right up the street from Vanderbilt in Belmont and kind of see that Belmont played toe to toe with Kentucky, and Belmont very good mid-major, one of the best mid-major women's programs really over the last 5 or 6 years or so. But they kept up with them very, very well. And a lot of it had to do with them being able to match with Kentucky physically, even though they were not necessarily as long. So it's going to be interesting to see that. Something else, too, Kentucky, not necessarily an amazing rebounding team necessarily as well. They're just outside the bottom five of the SEC in rebounding. So I'm really interested to see how that game is going to go because I think Vanderbilt matches up relatively well with them, even though they might be giving up a little bit of the length. And I think the biggest question too, just the guards. How fun is that guard matchup going to be? Who's going to step up next to Michaela Blakes? Is it going to be Ayanna Moore? Is it going to be Madison Green? We know what Camille Pierre is able to do as a forward that can play defense and also rebound and also really kind of find her way and maneuver away the buckets down low. There's just so many factors with this matchup and so many different players I think could really step up and be that difference maker on both sides. So that game's going to be a lot of fun. And as you mentioned, I think the crowd going to be a really big factor in that as well, especially with it being a game that has potentially so high stakes as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to overlook Georgia. Thankfully, mine and your job is
Yeah.
not to get the team ready because we haven't been doing a very good job of that so far, or we wouldn't have been. But Kentucky too. The last point I want to make is there's one player I think if she shows up in a game that we've seen her do already could make a big difference, and that's Leilani CAPS. She is extremely physical. She's a good rebounder at 5'10". She can score the ball. She can drive to the bucket. If Leilani CAPS comes off the bench and has a big game, that is going to propel Vanderbilt a big step forward in order to succeed in that game.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I feel like that Leilani Capnis has been one of Vanderbilt's most important players that really doesn't get talked about a lot because she comes in off of the bench. She's not someone that necessarily is a flashy scorer and puts up these crazy numbers, but she's been one of their most efficient players. She's shooting at 45% from the field. She's been locked down on defense, really has been that perfect guard to kind of come in off the bench and either pair with Michaela Blakes or Ayanna Moore, as well as with Jordan Oliver whenever they need to rest. And kind of act as a ball handler that can also score a little bit as well. So I think that she is someone that, even though doesn't necessarily get the same attention maybe as Michaela Blakes or someone like that, has been just as important as any of those players. And against a team like Kentucky and a team like Georgia as well, SEC guards are some of the best guards in the country. She's going to be a very, very important factor, especially with what she can do on the defensive end. She averages 2.3 steals per game. She's someone that really does step up for this Vanderbilt team. I'm excited to see how she plays in SEC play because we know what she's capable of doing against high majors of what she did last year with Penn State in the Big Ten.
Yeah, most definitely. So I know we touched on the next two games, but I'd love to look at the overall picture. I have a number in my head. I'll go ahead and throw it out there. I think that, SEC play as a whole, I think Vanderbilt's around a 9-win team. And I'll put you on the spot a little bit right here. How many wins do you see Vanderbilt winning in the SEC, just outside of just the regular season, not the SEC tournament or anything like that?
I think Vanderbilt is a 9-win team with the potential to be 10 or 11. And I say 9 just because I kind of prepare for this late. I did look at the entire schedule and I kind of put the games into tiers a little bit. And I have 6 games I feel like are should be wins. Georgia, Arkansas, A&M, Auburn, Florida, and Missouri. Those should all be games that if Vanderbilt comes in, takes care of business, and plays the way that we know they're capable of playing, should no question be wins. So that's 6 right there. So if you're looking to hit 9, that gives you 10 games that you have to get out of 3. So Kentucky, Tennessee, Ole Miss twice as Mississippi State, I think you could say those are probably toss-ups. Those are games that could go really either way. I personally think that they probably go about 2-3 to 3-2 in that stretch. I think they definitely win one of the games against Ole Miss. Kentucky and Tennessee, kind of a toss up. Both of those games are at home for Vanderbilt, so I think you could maybe give them the slight edge. Obviously, we also do not know what is going to happen with the Caldwell situation in Tennessee when she is going to have her kid. That we'll see what happens with that. And in Mississippi State, which is going to be a tough game on the road, a team that I think has maybe surprised a few people in terms of how good they have looked and how dominant they've looked as well. Games that are maybe, but I'm not going to favor Vanderbilt, LSU, Alabama, Oklahoma. Those are 3 teams that are comfortably ranked in the top 15. LSU, I think, actually could be a decent matchup for Vanderbilt. And the reason I say that is because LSU is not as I'm not going to say they're not as convincing. They are still a very, very good team, but I do think they are more dominant on the guard end than they are in terms of their bigs. Last year, having Angel Reese added another element to this LSU team that I don't think they have this year. I think in terms of the matchups positionally, Vanderbilt matches up very well with this LSU team compared to last year. Alabama, that's a team I think is a lot better than what I personally thought they'd be. Not sure how that one goes. And Oklahoma, obviously, a top 10 team that people feel like should be great as well. And then two games I just do not see them winning, although nothing would surprise me with Shea Ralph on our team. South Carolina and Texas. Not saying it's impossible, but just would be very, very surprised if they won either of those games. So Atlanta, kind of summarizing all of that, I'm going to say they're a 9-7 team in the SEC that has the potential to be 10-6 or 11-5. If they can flip two of those games, like a Tennessee, like a Kentucky, like a Alabama, then I could see them kind of getting a little bit higher than that and reaching a double digit mark. But just with how tough the SEC is, night in, night out, a lot of these tough games are going to be on the road as well. There also, I think, might be a game that Vanderbilt does lose that maybe they shouldn't, to be honest with you. I mean, maybe they go up against an Auburn or Texas A&M that need a win. They don't win that game. I'm going to say 9-7, but I would not be surprised in any stretch of the imagination if that's better. I'm probably being a little bit conservative, but 9-7, that's my official prediction for the SEC slate.
Yeah, I'm kind of there with you. I said nine. And I can see him winning 11 games or 10 games if they can win those kind of, coin flip type games. And, that happens to every team. A lot of teams lose a game that maybe they're not supposed to, maybe that they were favored in. And that's just basketball. Sometimes, it's not, the ball's not always going to fall through the hoop on the night that you need it to. And so, maybe that does happen. But I do see him winning 9 games, potentially up to 11. But I also don't see him winning below 8. I think that finishing below 500 would be a little bit of a step back in conference play from what they did last year, but I also think that they're better than they were last year, and that's why they're not going to win, less than 8 games. But I do agree with you. 9-7 is right around where I have them, just based off, the schedule where the games are played, things like that. To kind of touch on the Caldwell situation you mentioned, for people who don't know, Kim Caldwell, the head coach of Tennessee, is pregnant with her child, and he is actually due. The baby's supposed to be born on January 20th, so he's due then, and so she may not be coaching that game, depending on when her son is going to be born. We don't really know, and so that's going to be
And you
something to keep
mentioned
an
too,
eye on.
Elena, January 20th. I don't mean to cut you off. They play Vanderbilt January 19th.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's why that is such an important day. Didn't want to cut you off there, but just thought that was important
No,
to kind of
yes,
throw in there.
yeah. I thought I mentioned that, but you're my better half in these podcasts a little bit, so I appreciate that. But yes, that's an important date to keep an eye on. She might not be coaching that game. You never know when Baby Caldwell wants to make his official arrival. So we'll keep an eye on that one. But that's a big game too for Shea Ralph because she hasn't beaten Tennessee yet as a head coach. And so if for some reason Coach Caldwell isn't able to coach that game and they have an interim, while they, know the system, there is a bit of an adjustment between an interim head coach or someone filling in or an associate head coach stepping up as opposed to your head coach. There's just a little bit of a difference. And so maybe that's a game that Vanderbilt takes advantage of that if she's not able to coach. And so that is a very unique situation to keep an eye on.
Yeah, my apologies if you had already mentioned that date, but no, I completely agree. And you look at this Tennessee team, a very good team that I think has surprised people in terms of just how good they've looked and how consistent they've looked. I mean, they're one of the highest paced, highest scoring teams in the country. They average almost 99 points per game. They shoot almost 38 threes per game. This is going to be a very different Tennessee team that they play, and it's going to be interesting to see how Vanderbilt looks against them, especially if Kim Caldwell is not coaching that game. We're not sure what's going to happen. It's a very unique situation that we don't really see too often, but is she going to be on the sideline coaching that game? And if not, how does that affect some of the things with Vanderbilt or with Tennessee rather in terms of how they play, how they strategize the game, how they game plan for it? There are a lot of things, not that I'm experienced in this avenue at all, but there are a lot of things that come with having a kid to where it will pull you away from some of the things like coming up with a game plan, getting ready for film, and just so many aspects before the pregame prep. I think that this could affect Tennessee more in terms of the preparation for the game beforehand compared to things during the game to where you could maybe just kind of pre-prep things and have an assistant coach kind of come in and just lay out that plan that the coaching staff together has kind of already come in and just executing that vision that the head coach has. So it's going to be interesting to see how this whole thing unfolds, but that's a really big game as well, with the potential of it being a Vanderbilt versus Tennessee game in Memorial Gym. with both teams possibly being ranked, depending on how these first few games go. You got Georgia, you got Kentucky, a game at Ole Miss. That's another ranked team that they're going to be playing before that, and then at LSU. If Vanderbilt goes into that Tennessee game 3-1, and Tennessee will probably be around that same record in SEC play, that's going to be really, really interesting to see how that goes, especially since, like you mentioned, Shea Ralph has not beaten Tennessee yet as a Commodore. She's been on record saying she doesn't love those guys in terms of not in terms of anyone over there personally, but that UConn blood in her is still there. There's still a rivalry within her heart for Tennessee, even before she came to Vanderbilt. That's a game that probably means a little bit more to her. It means a little bit more to the program and the fan base. They want to beat Tennessee. And with it being a home game, they only play once now this year with the SEC schedule change. And it feels like this is as close as these two teams and these two programs have been in a really, really long time. That's going to be a really interesting game. 2 o'clock on a Sunday. That's going to be exciting. That's going to be really exciting to see how that one goes, especially if both teams do end up being ranked come January 19th.
Yeah, definitely a unique situation with Coach Caldwell. Obviously, you never know what's going to happen with those types of things. Just, at the drop of a hat, something could happen and she could take some time off. Again, you don't know how you're going to feel. You don't know how long. So we'll keep an eye on that. And of course, keep everyone posted to whether or not she'll be coaching that game. Things like that as we find out, because obviously that's a very big game for both sides. It's her first time playing Vanderbilt. That's a rivalry. Shea Ralph wants to beat Vanderbilt, or excuse me, wants to beat Tennessee at Vanderbilt for her first time. And so, of course, I'm sure both of those teams have the red pin circled around the calendar for that one. It's going to be a very exciting game. But let's talk about some keys to success in the SEC. If they want to win these 9, 10, 11 games, Brandon, there's some things that, they're going to have to do. There's two players that are the dynamic duo, and I'm sure I don't have to say their names, but I will for people who may not know who I'm talking about. Michaela Blakes and Camille Pierre. Man, they have been tremendous. They have been so much fun. Those two need to keep up what they're doing. Camille Pierre is averaging roughly 22, 23 points a game. Michaela Blake's at 19. Camille Pierre averaging a double-double as well. I believe she's averaging 11 rebounds. And so, obviously those numbers might take a slight bump down in the SEC play, but still, man, those two have been so fun to watch. So while those two have to keep it up, they need a third scorer. And we're going to kind of evaluate maybe who they might be. Two names obviously come to mind, one of them being Ayana Moore. She has struggled a little bit in the non-conference play, but we've seen what Ayana Moore is capable of. And that is scoring the basketball. And I think last year we kind of saw the same deal where she struggled in the non-conference. And it's like when the new year hit, a switch flipped inside and she started scoring the basketball the way that she's used to. I mean, she had 37 points down at Kentucky. That's her career high. And so I think that maybe trying to get her going, get some shots for her, run some plays for her. And another player I'm really enjoying watching off the bench the way she plays is Madison Green. She's been very efficient in scoring too. And so maybe she's also that other piece that they need to contribute 10 points or a solid, double figures every night. If they can get that out of her, that's going to be really big down the stretch. And I think Vanderbilt just needs to find that third scorer each game and not solely rely on Michaela Blakes and Camille Pierre.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that finding that consistent third scorer is going to be such a massive piece. And, you mentioned it. Obviously, we know what Vanderbilt's going to get from Camille Pierre and Michaela Blakes on a nightly basis. Pierre, absolutely stellar. I mean, not just on the offensive end, but she averages just under 4 steals per game, which is absolutely absurd, honestly. I feel like people don't talk about that enough of her because they get so enamored with what she's able to do on the offensive end. And Michaela Blake's one of the most talented freshmen in the country, averaging 19 points per game. It was over 20 points per game before the game against Alabama A&M, where she was held to 5. But I think you kind of know what you're going to get from those two on just about a night-to-night basis. Really, the question is who is going to be that third person next to them. I think Ayana Moore is that perfect candidate. She has struggled a little bit from the field. I think that the efficiency and the consistency from her hasn't necessarily always been there, but we have seen her kind of start to turn a corner, Elena, as you mentioned. I mean, on Sunday against Alabama A&M maybe wasn't her most efficient game necessarily per se. She shot 41% from the field though and had 16 points against West Georgia, 16 points, Dayton 14 points, Evansville 10, Miami 13. So we're seeing her kind of start to get her game going a little bit. And that Alabama A&M game was actually the highest field goal percentage that she had out of those 5 games at that 41%. So I think we're kind of starting to see Ayanna Moore slowly but surely find her game. Remember, she's kind of been thrusted into a new role a little bit. Last year, she was really kind of the primary scoring option a lot of times for this team. Obviously, you had Sasha Washington, you had Jordan Cambridge, but there wasn't a Michaela Blakes on this roster. Camille Pierre was not doing what she is doing now this time a year ago. So Ayanna Moore was kind of all of a sudden thrusted into a very different role than what she had last year. That takes time to adjust. But I think we're seeing her get more and more comfortable and show shades of the Ayanna Moore that we saw last season being an all SEC selection. And then you mentioned Madison Green, who has been absolutely phenomenal, averaging just a little under 10 points per game, 9.4 to be exact. She's shooting it rather efficiently as well at 45%, 35% from three, which is the highest or second highest for a Vanderbilt player. The only one that's higher is Jada Brown, who plays pretty limited minutes, obviously. So arguably Vanderbilt's best three-point shooter this year. It's been impressive because you have to remember she's coming off of a torn ACL that she tore just last December. So what she has been able to do for this team off of the bench has been still impressive. And I think it's going to be interesting to see who steps up on a night-to-night basis to be that third scoring option next to Camille Pierre, Michaela Blakes, to take some of that pressure off of them and give Vanderbilt a little bit more of that offensive punch in these SEC games.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a few minutes left, but I want to, touch on two more points that I think are going to be very important for Vanderbilt heading into conference play. One more player and then maybe a whole team kind of thing. Ayanna Mitchell obviously has taken a big step up. She has the size, the athleticism to compete in the SEC. I think that maybe getting, her some more minutes, seeing a little bit more production out of her is going to be big for her to match up with these bigger players and post players that other teams have. I mean, you think of Oklahoma with Reagan Beers. They're going to need somebody like Ayanna Mitchell's size in that kind of game. So maybe seeing a little bit more production from her will be a key down the stretch. Maybe not, always going to show up in the games and do the flashy things, but there might be some games where they just need her size to win. And so having her in there will be big. And then the other thing, too, is their defense and their intensity. And that's something that Shea Ralph is been proud of so far this year is the way that her team plays defense. And so it is very physical and they press you and they make it not very fun to play against you. And so I think that the defense that Vanderbilt shows other teams, it's difficult. And so if they can keep that high intensity defense too, it's going to win some of those games where both teams might be shooting equally that night. And so I think that, finding that third scoring option and then, having Ayanna Mitchell in for some of those games where they just need her size and the defensive intensity. I think those are the three things that Vanderbilt needs to succeed in order to win 9 to 11 games in the SEC this year.
Yeah, and Elena, you mentioned Ayanna Mitchell. How impressive has she been? I mean, she plays 12 minutes a game, but it feels like it's 20. She's been so impactful whenever she's been out there on the floor. I think that really, outside of probably Camille Pierre, has been Vanderbilt's most improved player this year. And we've heard Shea Ralph really rave about her, what she's been able to do. We heard her say early in the season that they've needed someone like Ayanna Mitchell to really step up because Vanderbilt in the past has been a team that has really lacked that size down low. And Ayanna Mitchell gives them that. She has a frame where she can eat up a lot of space in the paint at 6'4", and when she's able to be out there and she's able to really defend so many plays and kind of be that big body down there, it gives Vanderbilt an extra element to their team that they really haven't had in the past. So I think people or players like her really stepping up is going to be really, really big. I'm interested to see how she looks. And something else I think is going to be a key for Vanderbilt. We've heard Shea Ralph talk about this a lot. Consistent focus and consistent effort. That's been a bit of a key focus for Vanderbilt. Probably one of the flaws, I think, in their non-conference schedule. They would have some quarters and have some stretches where it feel like they would kind of take their foot off the gas a little bit and just kind of coast. I think that the first quarter against Hampton and Sanford were two that really stood out. The third quarter against West Georgia, Shea Ralph a couple of nights ago said she was really unhappy with. They lost that quarter, and she was like, kind of saying that's not something that should happen. So consistent energy, effort, and focus has been something that's been really big. You can't have those lapses in SEC play. You're just not going to be able to get away with that. So that's something else I think Vanderbilt's going to have a really high priority on against these SEC teams. And I think everyone would agree the best conference arguably in the country this year.
Most definitely. And there's a lot of things to be looking forward to right now. I mean, we've got a big week coming up. Brandon will be there again starting on Thursday for the night at 6:30 game against Georgia to open SEC play, then Sunday against Kentucky. They've got Tennessee in a couple of weeks, so obviously a lot of factors with that game that are up in the air and just a lot of exciting things going on with this program. There's no doubt that they've taken steps every year that Shea Ralph has been here, but I think that this year definitely feels like another step in the right direction for sure. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how Vanderbilt does going forward.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to be excited about for Vanderbilt, not just in terms of these upcoming games, this upcoming stretch, but again, just where this program is at. I mean, a couple of years ago, Vanderbilt was a team where you didn't really know where they were heading. I think a lot of people thought that it was going in the right direction with Shea Ralph, but I think that they're finally seeing the fruits of their labor of building this program back up really kind of shape itself. I mean, we're talking about this team being in the top 25 in a week from now if they can go 2-0. We're talking about massive games in Memorial Gym that have high stakes that people are going to be really excited to come out and watch. And I think it's going to be really fun and really interesting to see where this SEC slate goes. I know Shea Ralph has been very vocal saying she's excited for that part of the schedule and is interested to see what her team looks like and how they perform against these other SEC teams. I know we've been waiting for it, Atlanta. You know, we love that all basketball we can get. The non-conference schedule was great, but there's nothing like conference ball where the stakes are so high. I can't wait for it. This Vanderbilt team has been so fun to watch, so fun to cover. And Thursday's just 2 days away. We're almost there.
We're almost there. And so, when the holidays wrap up, sometimes people get a little sad that the joy is over, but the joy is just beginning, Brandon. SEC play starts in just 2 days, like you mentioned. Georgia comes to town, and then they host Kentucky, number 16 team in the country. Very big game, high stakes for Vanderbilt. And going forward, I think it's going to be very fun to follow along and see how they do this year. But for Brandon Bigsby and myself, we appreciate you guys spending time with us. And thank you all for supporting Vandy Sports. For now, we'll talk to you later, and we will see you all on Thursday.